Welcome to You Should Read This. I'm here together with Tom van der Lubbe, and this is us reviewing a book that we both have read and have appreciated. And this time round, it's Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, and which has become a pretty famous book, especially in business circles. But more broadly, I mean, it's had a huge impact in a range of fields. Daniel Kahneman is an Israeli psychologist and is the only psychologist to have won a Nobel Prize in economics, which is interesting, specifically behavioral economics. And his contribution with this book, for me, has been especially around biases, which we'll get into. Well, what is a cognitive bias and why is it important to understand them? He was perhaps the first author to really introduce me to this idea of bias. And the famous characters of his book are the System 1 and System 2, which we'll also get into as we discuss this book. But before we go much further, Tom, you also read the book. What drew you to the book?
Yeah, also I'm a big fan of biases and also about the whole, let's say, trying to understand decision-making processes. But we'll probably also dive into that. You always have the impression that you take right decisions, but it's a little bit more complicated. So it's interesting to see how those processes are. And in general, it's very interesting just to understand how the brain works, which is a pretty modern phenomena. And there are quite some books read about this. And I think, it gives us a lot of insights in how we act also in daily life, not only in business, but also in daily life.
Yeah. Well, let's lay out the main characters. Let's say that the System 1 and System 2. So these are fictitious. These aren't actual systems that can be identified, particular structures in the brain, but it's just a way to think about the way our brain works. And the first, System 1, is effortless. It provides us with answers to problems. It gives us the choice that we should make without any conscious effort on our part. Sometimes it's our impulsive intuition, if you like. It's just the first answer that comes to us, and we rely on it all the time, right, throughout our daily life. And then the System 2 is effortful. We rely on System 2 when we're faced with complicated choices, or complicated situations, which require us to analyze different options, to think more rationally about a situation. And this is the slow thinking that he refers to. System 1 is our fast thinking. And of course, we've evolved this ability to make fast decisions. We've needed to over the course of our evolution. But as human beings, we also have this slow thinking capacity, this ability to reason things out. And he makes the point that very often System 1 overrides System 2. And so even when we try and use our System 2, when we try and think rationally, System 1 overrides it. Even the most highly trained intellectuals, statisticians, and so on, when they've tested these individuals, they still fall prey to System 1 when analyzing situations where they could use their sort of statistical chops to come to a rational answer. They still are led by this impulse from System 1. Anything else to say about the systems as you understand them, Tom?
No, I think you're totally right. But I think it's if you reflect on this and if we dive into these examples, you feel a little bit annoyed also. So we as human beings think that we're a totally rational species, and it differs us from other animals, so to say. And on the one hand, that's the case. But on the other hand, there are so many examples where we really have to reflect on and say, okay, I thought I'm very rational and taking very rational decisions, but I'm not. So, and that's a kind of eye opener, I guess.
Yeah. And I wondered if we might give an example of this, which is with the Linda example, which is from chapter 15, just to illustrate for people here. So let's just read it out. And and for those listening, you can work this out for yourself. So Linda is a 31 years old, single, outspoken, and very bright. She majored in philosophy. As a student, she was deeply concerned with issues of discrimination and social justice, and also participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations. Now, from the following, which do you think best fits this description of Linda? Linda is a teacher in an elementary school. Linda works in a bookstore and takes yoga classes. Linda is active in the feminist movement. Linda is a psychiatric social worker. Linda is a member of the League of Women Voters. Linda is a bank teller. Linda is an insurance salesperson. Linda is a bank teller and is active in the feminist movement. Now, when they put this to people doing this exercise, consistently people choose Linda is a bank teller and is active in the feminist movement as being more likely than Linda being a bank teller. Now, of course, rationally, statistically, she's much more likely to be a bank teller than a bank teller who is active in the feminist movement. But because we build this picture of Linda in our mind based on our past experience of people who might have been similar to her in profile, we're led by system one towards Linda is a bank teller and is active in the feminist movement. Whereas, rationally speaking, she's much more likely to be a plain old bank teller than she is to be a feminist bank teller. So I thought that was a good illustration of how we all fall prey to this tendency, and just one, of course.
Yeah, what I like as an example or dislike as an example is let's have a look. It's about the jury, or let's say in court. So depending on the time where your case is dealt with, there's a higher chance of getting higher punishments, which I find, and there's a lot of research done on that. So when you ever have to be in court, then it should be in the morning, but not just before lunch.
Right, that's right.
Because if your case is dealt with just before lunch, the chance, because they're hungry, you will punish much harder. So which I found really, if you really have to think about this, I mean, these are very well educated people. Their job is to wage justice, etc. And then there's enormous correlation if they're hungry or not. So I find it pretty striking.
Right. And that speaks to, in fact, that speaks to the all of research on willpower, because that example also gets studied. Roy Baumeister, who was on my other podcast, wrote the book Willpower, cites that example of where our ability to make rational decisions is in itself an act of willpower, and willpower is depleted when we're under-resourced. If we're tired, if we're hungover, as you say, if we're hungry, we're less able to use our willpower. We're also less able to engage system two, in Kahneman's lexicon. So I think that's important. And was also interesting that. Go on, sorry.
It even goes further, because I read this in Dutch, so I have a little bit problems with the right examples. But there, in this example, perhaps you remember it. They have to throw. How do you call this in a play? And there is a correlation between the numbers they have. So if you have those plays and you have from 1 to 6, or here it's called in Dutch. It's called dobbelstenen. I should read the book in English when I do an English bookcast, by the way. But there is a correlation. So, but there's a lot of research done on that. So you do something, and then there's an experiment afterwards, and there's no connection whatsoever. So then let's say if you have here it says if they have the amount of points is higher of this play, then also the punishments are higher. But it has nothing to do with this game, and then afterwards the punishment. So it's incredible that we would never expect that such a rational process, being in a jury or being active in court, that people are influenced by this.
Right. I'm not sure I followed your example with the play and the point. So you just break that down again.
It's let's have a look which is the reference index is called. So let's have a look which chapter this is. It's about heuristic and biases, and then it says 11
anchors.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Rigging a wheel of fortune.
And that's really, really striking.
Right. And so, well, should we talk about the anchoring effect? Is that what you're referring to here?
Yeah. And then you're talking about justice, huh? You're talking about that let's say people in court have to decide on, let's say, how much time somebody has to spend behind bars for certain. And then,
you can imagine there, like if the judge were to choose to say before instructing the jury to come up with a punishment, right? The guideline for this offence is 20 years in prison. He's probably going to get a different outcome than if, let's say, he were to say the average sentence for this crime is 10 years in prison, right? Because he'll anchor, and then jury will use that as a reference point when they make their decision. Yeah. And that's an example of system one hijacking, right? Because we just, that's easy. That gives us an easy way to make a choice here. I can just reference my, I can just make my judgment in reference to that, into that anchor. That's much easier than me to fully engage system two and work through all the possible reasons, that all the factors that might contribute to what my sentencing decision might be, and then to come up with a decision by myself.
Yeah, and there are a lot of more, let's say, simpler examples. So if you just go into a shop and it says, let's say this trousers, the old price was this and it's crossed, and then the new price is that, then that's perhaps something we realize. So if you go for jeans and it says this jeans costed £100 and it's crossed, and now it costs 50, then you say, 50 is cheap because before it was 100. That's something which probably just in daily life we also realize a little bit as a human being.
Yeah, but I must admit, I still fall prey to it, and I know this. That's what's also interesting, is that it doesn't make a difference if you know this stuff, because this is subconscious system. Yeah. The people who understand these biases and know better, this is what's so sort of depressing about it, and know better at avoiding being hijacked in their biases by the people who are unaware.
Yeah, that's correct. And what is also perhaps interesting to take as an example is because the point you just make is that if you know something is wrong, but it's repeated all the time, then even your opinion is undermined or changes with that, which I also find a very good example, probably why people survive in let's say in dictatorship, so to say, or in this extreme situation. So we think we are able not to be influenced by that. And you see the same, there are so many videos on this, let's say, if let's say there's a wall is white, and then let's say 10 people said it's blue, then also people will enter the room saying, okay, it's blue, although everybody sees it's white. So it's very interesting how far this goes. There doesn't seem to be a limit on this.
Right.
Although we think we are very intelligent and we decide for ourselves, but it's just not. In the end, it's just not the case. There are so many examples about this.
You're right.
And in politics, in politics, you also see this. So that's why, and it's also in the book about authoritarian leaders. It's a kind of commercial. Huh? You just repeat it and repeat it and repeat it. and then in a way your brain is influenced by that.
Right. And we're seeing it right now in terms of people's, if they've done surveys on how many people they think have died through COVID, and it's a massive multiple of the actual number of deaths because of the availability bias, right? What's on the news right now, it's, every day it's how many people have died of COVID. And so that plays in people's psyches. And so System 1 latches onto that. We've created an emotional experience in our reaction to that news report. And that lodges in our psyche and forms the basis of our availability bias.
Yeah, and what I also find, let's say, a good example, and probably also realize themselves, that if you have slept well and if you're happy, then you just take better decisions. There's also this link to psychological safety, etc. And if you fear, if you didn't sleep well, if you're hungry, etc., it has an enormous influence on the quality of your decision making. I mean, there are also examples in the book of that, but let's say this is probably something we as human beings are familiar with, and we notice ourselves for instance, in meetings when it's going to lunchtime. But it goes much further than that, and that's what I find interesting about the book of Kahneman.
Yeah. Now the other there's a couple of aspects that I found really helpful just in my daily life as a professional. Two biases, should I say, right, that I found very useful that he describes. One is the validity illusion, right? And that's and I apply that especially to planning. So a lot of the work I do when I'm consulting with companies is I'm engaging with people and their plans, right? They've got grand plans, let's say how they're going to change an organization. And what you see repeatedly as a pattern in these organizations, of course, and we'll all be familiar with this, is the go live date slips, right? This moment in time when you predicted you're going to achieve X just keeps creeping forward and forward and forward. And every time it slips, nobody ever questions why they're engaged in this. They just sort of merrily get on with the replanning and then all get behind the new date. Seemingly oblivious to the fact that they're incapable of, creating a plan that they can that's accurate and predictable, and that comes out of this optimism bias that we have, right? To anchor on like the best case scenario, our inability to consider unknowns, our inability to consider that there may be things we haven't even considered that could affect our plan, and so this results in us experiencing a validity illusion. We'll look at this plan and we'll tell ourselves it's valid for XYZ reasons, without considering that this is a product of, largely speaking, System 1. It's an intuition on where we think this date might land. It's not a fully, rational process that's produced this date. And in some ways, perhaps we don't have the capability to calculate all of the factors that we would need to in order to create an accurate plan. But yet we engage in it anyway. And the point he makes in the book is that humans would prefer to be certain and wrong than uncertain and right. So if the correct assessment of the situation was, this is not possible to predict. It's not possible to predict when we might achieve this particular activity because we don't have all available at hand. We don't have the rational capability to come up with a predictive model here. But I don't want to feel uncertain, so I'd rather be wrong and certain. I think that's such a sort of a powerful concept to take on.
Perhaps what is interesting is also that Kahneman just very openly explains that he's a big fan of Nassim Taleb.
Right.
So the third part of the book is about his confidence or overconfidence, etc., which you'll see in a lot of fields, especially in business, by the way, much stronger in business than in other parts of society. And there's an enormous amount of examples. We also, just before we started, we talked about Charlie Munger, the colleague of Warren Buffett. And those people, I like them a lot, also Taleb, because they have a very systematic way of, and the Kahneman does exactly the same, listing all these biases or overconfidence examples. and then you read them, you go through them, and then you have, for instance, that a positive outcome doesn't have anything to do with a good process. So just splitting them. But if there's a positive outcome, we think that we have a good process. That has nothing to do with each other. So, and this kind of things you see. I mean, you have them in the COVID crisis, but you have them in management more or less all the time. And this whole black swan topic. So we act in a lot of situations as if something is a surprise, but it's not. But that's because we don't analyze our ways of decision making. It's just we do something and then it's positive, and then we think that our processes are excellent, and just not the case. And this third part of the book, there are a lot of examples of Taleb. And the chapter I like most as an entrepreneur is that entrepreneurs, which I also see all the time, they are the most extreme species of overconfident people, because that's why the reason they become entrepreneurs, because they think they know much better than everybody else where there is a chance of selling something or producing something or leaving their former company. And then I don't know if this is in this book, I'm not quite sure anymore, but that even if you tell entrepreneurs with a lot of research that it doesn't make sense to start, and then they also proved after they started that it didn't make sense, all those entrepreneurs, they still go for it because they believe that they are the exception. Yeah. So, which I find very interesting. So if people sometimes ask, should I become an entrepreneur? Then I always answer, from a statistical point of view, it's not a good decision.
Right. Because
the chance that you will survive is very, very small. So let's say with a company, we're 50 now, we're in the last 2%. So if you have a good paid corporate job, from a statistical point of view, it's not a good idea to become an entrepreneur.
Right.
And then you can say it becomes a little bit better idea when you're 45 and have 20 years of corporate experience. But then people think that you should be a dropout from Harvard, and then you have a bigger chance because then they take Zuckerberg and Bill Gates, etc. But that's the statistical exception to the rule.
Yeah. Yeah. But then, of course, it begs the question, well, if everybody only took decisions based on system 2 and never just dived in, well, we wouldn't have entrepreneurship, and we,
No, but there are at least, let's say, if you have enough experience. So the most successful entrepreneurs, they are 43 or 45 when they start. There's a lot also research done on that.
Yes.
Which is, let's say, I would say even perhaps common, on the one hand, common sense, because if you have a lot of experience in a corporate environment, then you know what's the right time. Perhaps you already have customers, you all have lessons learned, etc. So a certain amount of experience in a certain field gives you network, blah, blah, blah. So chances become higher. But just in general, you see, and it's chapter 24, they're just born optimists. So and if you work in those companies, it's very, very difficult also from a cultural point of view that everybody is always in favor of doing something because they're all positive and we believe it will happen, etc. And to say, oh, stop, is this a good idea? Should we do it the other way around? That's something which is very much cultivated by Taleb and others, Charlie Munger, etc., because they are very consistently analyzing all these biases and all these mental mistakes you can make. And then they just do the whole checklist and they say, this decision I just take, could it be a bias? Let's check. And then they just check the whole list. But that's just what the general entrepreneur doesn't do. And that's why
that in
my
itself
point of view,
says,
it's a very good, very good book for this.
And the level of discipline required to go through that process, right, is something that would defeat most people. I mean, I put myself in that class. I can't imagine myself sitting down with a list of biases and checking each of them off before I make a decision. I mean, I think that would take a certain diligence in one's personality. You need to be a pretty special type to do that. But I totally see the value of it. And in fact, we had the author of what's the book? Anyway, he was his profession. Well, he's a professor. He's had a lot of influence on the insurance industry and risk assessors. Mm-hmm. And he was making a similar point that risk assessors should have a bias matrix that they apply to all of their assessments when they're making them, and that should be part of risk assessment in general, right? And I don't think that's permeated sort of consciousness, right? Is that we should do that on major programs, major projects, insurance industry, is that we actually go through bias-based risks, right? Yeah. You don't hear that, do you?
Yeah. But that's why I find it interesting that those people who do this more systematically, they are in this extreme financial industry, or let's say extreme parts of financial industry. So Taleb is a former trader. Charlie Munger analyzing, let's say, shall I buy the company or not? I mean, and then they're ending up buying companies, but that's the end of an enormous process of analyzing all those companies. So, but you have the same side. You have the same aspect. There's a big correlation of people who are really good poker players. I mean, I don't know anything about poker, but there you have the same mental process. So you have to analyze all these options, and then say, okay, I go for this decision. And then people say, okay, if I'm able to take all this data and analyze it, then I have a chance to win. And it's the same process Taleb does, and also Charlie Munger does.
Yeah. The other thing I like about Taleb is when he talks about his investing is that he won't look at, and he used to get in trouble for this, like from his bosses when he was in his early days as a trader, from what I understand, is he wouldn't, like his boss might ask him, how's your portfolio? Are you up or you down? What's going on? And he would consciously not check, right? He'd only check his portfolio. I think it was once a quarter or something. It was period, but he was very disciplined about it, and he wouldn't expose himself to the up and down on a daily basis because he knew that would excite his system one, right? That's going to get him into, impulsive, emotional state that might have him make decisions that don't make sense. So he deliberately detached himself from both the state of his portfolio and news in general, right? I mean, he's sort of famous for it. It's considered one of his big achievements is having completely given up news for the same reason, is to avoid that daily hijack that our system one is so engaged with.
Yeah, very much focused on the short term, and it doesn't make sense. It even has the opposite effect.
Yeah,
but this media consumption is exactly the same topic as if you read the first page of a newspaper, doesn't matter where. It's the opposite of what's really interesting in the long term.
Right.
And it gives you a totally different view of the world. So if you just take, there's always somebody who, there's also misery going on, but then you're too much focused on, I don't know, a child which disappeared or an elderly lady which was lost her handbag, etc. So it gives you, and if you read this day after day, your whole idea of reality changes.
Right. Yeah.
It has to do also with fear. Eh? It's and then you're in the brain again. So.
Yeah. Yeah, and this is what we talked about a little bit before we spoke, is that so there's this double-edged sword of our sort of emotionally driven intuition, right? On the one hand, it can drive us to irrational decisions that are not in our best interests. And yet, it certainly in my experience, it's my intuition, my emotional impulse, that when it comes to the most complex challenges, is my best source for decision making, right? So there's this interesting paradox here that, on the one hand, and so many of life situations, the worst thing we can do is trust our intuition. And yet, in certainly in my experience, in the most meaningful realms of my life and where I've had to make decisions, it's been my intuition that has brought me to the right decision.
But I'm a little bit ambivalent. So what I always find interesting is also, I think it's chapter 19 is the first chapter of this third part, where it's about Taleb, and then they ask people to do a prediction, and then I don't know, 5 years or 10 years later, or just after something took place, they analyze it again, and they ask, what did you predict? And people just tell something totally different. So let's say I really don't know if, let's say, certain opinions I have. I mean, I didn't write down every opinion in the past. And now I would say, okay, no, this is not a good idea. You should do it like that. But perhaps also my view changed, or I make exactly the same mistake and say, no, that always has been that was my prediction. So I'm really, I think it's perhaps we're just not really totally fair if we analyze ourselves, but perhaps there's also reason for that, because we're just more positive thinking. I don't know. I mean, it's probably also biological reason for that. But if we are very honest, probably, let's say, this whole idea I take from an intuition, a right decision. In many cases, perhaps it's right. If you talk about, let's say, the prehistorical part of the brain and running away and fear or fighting, etc. But on the other hand, when it becomes more rational, I'm really not quite sure if this analysis we make now is as dishonest and incorrect as all these examples show us in the book.
So you're suggesting that even system 2 is as prone to error in some cases as system 1 is?
Now, just for instance, I take this example about this overconfidence, and then somebody asks a prediction, and I mean, the more it goes to that you have to say a number or who wins, etc. And then you ask the same people, or they even taped then those predictions or these opinions, and they said, it's my voice, but it must be, it must have been somebody else. I don't know who has the same voice, you know? So it's a kind of, I don't know, a very strange way of behaving. And because of the fact that it's so extreme, that's about the same aspect as if you talk about these court cases, where you would say, no, there's very well educated people and they are so wise, etc. And that's why they are have this responsibility to decide how long somebody has to stay in prison. Even in this kind of situations, it doesn't work at all. So why should it work when I have predicted something in the past, or when I have taken a decision in the past, and think now we have the right process in place? Perhaps it also was much more luck involved. And the process totally wrong, but we never found out.
Right. And so what you're suggesting, that you as an individual overestimate your ability to use your system too. Is that what you're saying?
No, for me, the question is why shouldn't I be much better than all the examples in the book? So if I would be responsible in court, I also would give higher sentences just before lunch.
Right.
Why wouldn't I just stay, let's say, less vulnerable to that?
Right. And I think
or let's say we just talked about how much did we sleep. Why would I think that in the end, although I think I don't need a lot of sleep, why do I still have this overconfidence that it doesn't influence my quality of decision making when I didn't sleep very well?
Right. I don't know, maybe. See, I do. I am in full acceptance that I would be just as bad as those judges, right? Now, I might not be present to the fact I'm sort of self-deluded in that way when I'm making the decision, but if I step back, I know I'm just as prone to this as anybody else.
But you have it in a lot of things, even in if it's about love, or I mean, you can put it, or psychological stuff, etc., or trusting people, etc. You just don't know, and the question is also, you can't do a kind of backtesting, with stocks you bought. You can do backtesting, but you can't do backtesting on, let's say, decision making on people.
No,
so it makes so that's why I think that those people who are extremely intelligent in writing about all these biases, etc., they are from this very rational parts of life where you can do backtesting. I mean, right. if you study psychology, you can't do backtesting on your patients. But if you buy stocks, then you can do backtesting on your stocks, like Taleb or Charlie Munger.
Right. So they've got some ways to almost hold their decision making to account, right? Because there's a more easily analyzable record, right, of their decisions.
So how do you know that the decisions you consider to be the right ones, because it was your intuition? What would have been I find it very, very difficult to.
And of course, ultimately, I have no basis on which to make that claim. From a purely evidential basis, it's my intuition telling me that it's my intuition that in some cases serves me well. I think there is one distinction I would make in the way that I use which is how I might build my case here. But I get that there's no way of me proving this out. But is that when I sit with my intuition over time, and I keep checking in, maybe it's through meditation, maybe it's through journaling, and I build a sense of a consistent theme coming through in terms of what my intuition is telling me over time. I believe that to some degree inoculates me from this being a reactive, emotional impulse to a particular circumstances at a moment in time, right? If this is I know it talks about, in spiritual sense as the quiet voice, right? Mm-hmm. It's that voice, and it tends to be quite, if I'm listening to it, it tends to be persistent, and it keeps coming back, and it keeps coming back. Mm-hmm. And purely subjectively, when I've listened to that, my subjective assessment of when I've listened to that is that it has produced good outcomes. Now, the other version of intuition, if you like, which is like the hot intuition, which is, I'm in this situation. I got to act, right? I'm going to do this. When it's that more, when it's a decision that's made in a state of much more heightened emotions, then I think that my subjective assessment is that the decisions I've made based on that style of intuition, or in that context, that those have not been good. They've always been poor.
Yeah, but I still, for instance, take in the book, you have this halo effect, and he takes management literature, Jim Collins. And I mean, there are a lot of this. So most of the management literature is you take a certain amount of companies, and then you even take, let's say, revenues or profits or growth whatsoever. And here he takes Jim Collins, Built to Last, and then he says it's just not true. So, which I find very funny. Because he got this Nobel Prize for economics. So because he just says we see something successful, and then we make the correlation, let's say, the other way around. So the question also is, if you, let's say, in hindsight, let's say you say, okay, that was a good decision. Perhaps your brain just erases all the wrong decisions. And you only see a certain part of your reality, and you just pushes all the other stuff away. Like we discussed before, this effect of repeating things which are not correct. So it's I'm let's say, if you just read this, I mean, it's a thick book, huh? So if you read all those examples, I think you become much more humble towards your idea that you take those good decisions. But we as human beings are in a lot of cases not able to do the 20 biases, check all the boxes, which you could do perhaps for buying a stock, and that still makes it very, very, very difficult.
Yeah, no, and I take your point. It may well be that I'm subject to my own biases, even when analyzing this particular topic. Yes, and I think your point about his analysis of the good to great companies, they thought they'd found a correlation, and they distilled out all the characteristics and principles behind these companies and wrote a book about it and said, this is what you should do to have a great company. And of course, over the long run, their performance has been proved out to be no better than any other collection of companies that you might take. And I think that speaks to your point about luck. Luck has such a huge part to play in this, right? I mean, did these companies just happen to luck out in the right set of circumstances over that period?
Yeah, or just to take perhaps a very practical example, because people will probably know the books of Malcolm Gladwell, Blink, etc. And then he just explains it. He says what we call intuition is just the amount of experience.
Right.
And so what is intuition? Is intuition just that you have more experience than somebody else? Because let's say, and you take the fireman, I think, in the building, which is an example often taken, because it feels strange here. But it's probably a kind of experience they have, a certain, let's say that there is a kind of smell or a heat or a noise or whatsoever. It just, and then he say it feels, we have to leave the building. And then experienced firemen, they leave the building before it comes down. And then he would say, now that's just the amount of experience, but it's really, really difficult to, in that moment, to grip these different aspects.
Right. Which might explain serial entrepreneurs, because if we took everything you said on face value, serial entrepreneurs shouldn't exist, right? They should be just as prone to luck as anyone else, and there's no reason why they would consistently win over time.
There's correlation. So private equity companies really like serial entrepreneurs, but they should still have skin in the game.
Yeah.
But the chances are higher from a statistical point of view. And then you take the positive ones. So you have an entrepreneur, he sells the company and does the next one. But they shouldn't be so rich that there is no skin in the game.
Right.
So they like let's say professional investors like experienced entrepreneurs, and also the negative experiences. But it has to. But I mean, in the end, they should have more positive experience than negative ones, because otherwise, you wouldn't invest in them. But there is also kind of correlation, which only would, let's say, defend this idea of experience.
Yeah, that makes sense. I did do another thing that comes up, which is related, is where he does that analysis of CEOs of companies, right? And there's only slightly better than even odds that a success, like a high performing quote CEO, is going to have a company that's any more high performing than those in its sector, because luck plays such a vital is such a vital part of the performance of firms versus the individual skill of a CEO, which must be uncomfortable reading for any remuneration committees of large companies.
Yeah, but that's also what they know. There's not a huge difference. Who's running the company?
Yeah.
So, but that's the topic where he criticizes Jim Collins, and I think the last part of the book is about let's say his topic. I think he got a Nobel Prize for this whole behavioral economics, where we also this for what you also can measure much easier than the other stuff. For instance, loss aversion, etc.
Yes.
So, but how will you measure loss aversion and this kind of things, where you just can't count it in relationships, etc.? It's just undoable. But if you just ask, let's say, just in numbers, would you go for this or that, or how long do people still bet on certain stocks, for instance? That's something which you can really in a simple way measure. But all those much more complicated decisions, how will you do a kind of backtesting, or how will you compare them? That makes it so difficult.
Yeah. But the takeaway on that topic is that we're much more prone to avoid loss than we are to chase gain, right?
Yeah.
And that makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. So when we're faced with even a choice that's statistically in our favor, means we're more likely to get a gain than we are to experience a loss.
Yeah.
We'll avoid the gamble because we're so averse to the potential loss.
Yeah, that's right.
Which is seems to be an interesting flaw. Yeah, and but I have to say, with that aspect, I found less utility in my day-to-day decision. The biases stuff I really get, and even though that is a form of bias, of course, loss aversion. In particular, I don't know. Perhaps I would have found more relevance if I had, I don't know, a profession that meant I was needing to analyze risk to a greater degree. But for me, the value was in the biases work.
But for instance, to get the circle round, or how do you come back to the starting point, is that this last part where you talk about behavioral economics, it's just interesting that this whole idea, this something is rational, and this whole discipline of economics as an extreme example, then he just says, and loss aversion that you just explained, it's not rational, because otherwise you would decide on much more, let's say, egalitarian way. But we don't like. We are loss averse. So just take this as an example for all the rest, which you can't measure so easily. And then depending on how important the decision is, then you can decide how many biases you want to take into that. But let's say if you just take as a business person, what I find very interesting, and that's also perhaps something for the COVID crisis, an interesting topic, is that if you just see that, let's say in business life, half of the time is a recession period or difficult times, or perhaps when it's not 50%, but would it be, let's say, 40? And if you just see how much liquidity companies have, it's as if they always are in the booming era, which is an extreme simple example to explain that it should be different. So you should have an enormous amount of cash in the bank just to be able to survive in these difficult times. But if you just see in general in our economy, how many companies needed support immediately after a couple of weeks, that's enormous, which illustrates just what we just discussed, that entrepreneurs or people who mainly have studied economics only live, let's say, in the positive
yes.
era, and they think it's the sky is the limit. But and then you come back to the Bible: seven wealthy years and 7 very difficult years. It's the same. It's not 10 and 4. No, it's 7.
Right. Just thought in that. From that aspect, I thought Bill Gates was interesting, right? His idea was that any company should always have at least a year's worth of money in the bank to pay all of their staff and expenses. I mean, I thought,
sure,
that's interesting. Which I must admit I don't have in terms of my personal finances, but it does make complete sense. I'm one of those more optimistic entrepreneurs living in System 1, perhaps a bit too much. So that's I think it's a powerful book from that perspective. It provided a mirror to me in my own, because, the extent to which I'm a rational thinker, because I think that's something important to separate, right? You can have high intellect, but that doesn't necessarily correlate with how rational you are in terms of your decision making. And he proves that outright. In some cases, he found that the more educated somebody was, the more likely they were to fall prey to System 1. So.
It also would be for another time perhaps interesting that, for instance, women, if you talk about loss aversion, they stop earlier. So they are they in a lot of ways take better decisions.
Right.
Because this overconfidence is much more a male personality, so to say.
Yeah.
Which is also, I mean, you can go back to let's say to the historic context, etc., hunting, etc. But it's which I also find interesting. But I mean, it's such a broad topic, and then you come to how important is the collective, how important is the team, what's feminine leadership, etc. So I mean, there's so many other topics which are interconnected to this, because but I would say, just as a conclusion, be aware of this overconfidence you have in a lot of different aspects.
Yeah, I'd say that. And then the second thing is, read this book if you like the sound of what we've discussed, and there's value in studying these biases, getting to understand them.
Or at least be aware.
Be aware of them.
Yeah, if you still say no, I go for it, but then that's why I think one of the powerful examples in the book is how to solve it, and that would be my last remark, is that you can that if you take a decision, you should describe or take the time to write about the disaster. So you take a decision and you're forced to write about the negative outcome, what was the effect of this negative outcome, which let's go back to this very practical example. If you would have to write down what it would mean to go bankrupt, entrepreneurs would have more cash in the bank.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Well, what a wonderful note to end this on. Really appreciated the conversation, Tom. I hope our listeners did too. Give us some feedback on these conversations, and I look forward to the next book and the next episode of You Should Read This. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Richard.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of You Should Read This with me, Richard Atherton, and my co-host, Tom van der Lubbe. If any of the material we covered in the show resonates with you, and if you're left with questions like, how do I implement this in my leadership, or how do I take these ideas into an organization, I'd love to have a conversation about that. And you can book time directly into my calendar with the Calendly link in the episode description. And I'd love to have a conversation and talk more about the content in today's show. Cheers.